Previous presentation defined informed consent, that set of practices that truly define the patient-professional relationship in modern healthcare. In this presentation, we want to look at the moral basis for those practices in our principles and other moral values. I've asked you to read a short essay from the President's Commission on Bioethics about the values underlying informed consent, or we might say the moral basis or the moral reasoning behind these informed consent requirements. What's interesting about what the President's Commission says is that they begin not with autonomy or patient self-determination as we might expect. Rather, they begin with the principle of beneficence or a concern about patient well-being. And their point is, in beginning there, is that medical interventions will not, in fact, truly promote patient welfare or not promote patient welfare as effectively as possible unless patients are fully involved in the decision-making about their care. Why is that the case? Well, according to the President's Commission, there in fact is quite often no objective or neutral medical basis for preferring one treatment plan or one treatment option over another. Often, various treatment options are equally effective or differently effective. And in such a situation, it's the patient's subjective values that are truly determinative for picking that option which best promotes that particular patient's welfare. So in fact, according to the President's Commission, if, as we generally assume, the very purpose of an interaction between patients and healthcare professionals or the healthcare industry is the promotion of patient welfare, we must include patients in decision making. We must meet the requirements of voluntary informed consent if those interactions are truly going to promote patient welfare effectively. Now, after those considerations related to beneficence, the President's Commission does turn to what we would expect, a concern about patient self-determination or considerations related to the principle of autonomy. But you should notice, and I hope you find interesting, this idea that the President's Commission offers, that the place to begin in thinking about why we must meet the requirements of voluntary informed consent is simply thinking about patient welfare or our obligations under the principle of beneficence. Post and Bluestein are very helpful in identifying and talking about a concern that many biomedical ethicists have about the actual practice of informed consent requirements in many medical settings. The concern is that healthcare professionals take a legalistic approach, an approach you might say that follows the letter of the law or the letter of informed consent requirements without actually honoring the spirit or the moral values, we might say, that underlie voluntary informed consent. Such an approach often involves simply asking, okay, what information must I disclose to the patient? The concern isn't to discern what of all that you might say to the patient is truly relevant to them and to their lives and their values and their decision, nor is the concern about whether or not the patient understands. The concern is simply, let's make sure we dump the information on the patient that voluntary informed consent requirements demand of us. That may well take the form of simply shoving some pamphlet or some sheet of paper with what is thought to be the relevant information in front of the patient. But again, no attempt to discern what that patient really wants to know and no attempt to discern what his or her values are. Also, sometimes it seems that informed consent requirements in some medical settings are thought to be met simply by making sure that the proper forms are signed. Now, surely voluntary informed consent, like everything else in the medical context, must be documented. But simply having a patient's signature on a document does not, in fact, honor the process, honor the values toward which voluntary informed consent is meant to point. Such an approach seems designed primarily to avoid lawsuits. Notice this passage from Post and Bluestein on pages 39 and 40. They say, when it functions well, informed consent is not an event, a moment in time, a perfunctory discussion, or a signed document, but a process. Meaningful consent is voluntarily and knowledgeably given by the patient, not secured or imposed by the staff as part of an assignment. Consent is not something that a physician extracts from or does to the patient. Quote, you need to get consent from Mrs. Simon, or, quote, I consented, Mr. Thomas. This attitude violates the autonomy of the patient and makes the signed consent form a trophy rather than the documentation of a process of communication, education, understanding, and trust. Or consider this from the next page. The physician should begin the process by determining what the patient knows and whether he wants to participate in decisions about his care. Ongoing discussion should confirm his decisional capacity, his preferences and values, his appreciation of his condition, and the implication of his choices. The informed consent process thus assumes greater significance than simple physician disclosure of information and patient permission for treatment. It is an interaction between patient and physician, often including the family or trusted others, that promotes the exchange of relevant information and the provision of guidance and support that facilitates effective decision making. Now, I want to affirm everything that Post and Bluestein say here, but I also want to add that the emphasis is a bit too much on physicians, as if informed consent is exclusively a physician concern. As I've already said, it's very often nurses and other allied health personnel who are best placed to make sure that patients understand, best placed to discern patient values, best placed to discern whether or not the patient is truly engaged in this process. Notice in this context in Post and Bluestein, they're concerned about language and the educational barriers to effective communication. It may well often be nurses, above all others, who are in the position to make sure those educational and language barriers are overcome in the informed consent process.